Hi there everyone, I'm Lauren Bell. I'm a cognitive behavioural therapist and some of you may know me as the Yorkshire Therapist. So the purpose of this video today is to talk to you all a little bit about needle phobia. So I've been aware kind of in my private practice and in my NHS practice that we're starting to see the presentation of needle phobia a little bit more at the minute. And I think that's off the back of the fact that we're obviously all living in a global pandemic. We're finally getting a bit of a light at the end of the tunnel in that we've got, the option of having a COVID vaccine, and people who are suffering with needle phobia are often, in a really tricky position because the choice really has been taken away from them because they feel so scared of having an injection or having a needle that they feel unable to make the choice to kind of go ahead and have the vaccine. So I thought I'd just do you a very brief presentation on kind of needle phobia, what it is, how we treat it in CBT, and give you just some general hints and tips as to how you might be able to go about trying to treat your own needle phobia. This is by no means a comprehensive overall treatment package. So, if you watch this today and think that this is something that you would like to kind of work on and approach properly using therapy, by all means kind of contact me through my private practice, the Yorkshire Therapist, or contact your local kind of GP and you can be referred for some free CBT therapy to overcome the phobia that way. So what I'm going to do now is I've just prepared a brief presentation, so I'm going to share my screen and let's have a little look at what this is, if it's going to let me do it. Bear with me 1 second. So as you all know, I'm Lauren Bell. I'm a cognitive behavioural therapist and I've been doing this job for the last 12 years now. I currently work in the NHS and I run my own private practice, which is the Yorkshire Therapist. I absolutely love my job. I love CBT. I'm a huge believer in it. I'm really a huge advocate for therapy in general, really. So therapy is something that, really can change lives, and it's very, very readily available at the minute. So, if you're struggling with needle phobia or with anything else, really, I really hugely would kind of recommend reaching out and getting some therapy and just letting us help you, really. So what is CBT? So for those of you who've never heard of CBT before, so CBT stands for Cognitive Behavioural Therapy. So Cognitive Behavioural Therapy is a type of therapy that is a blend of talking therapy and practical skills-based therapy. So I always say to my patients, it's about us, first of all, talking about what the problem is and kind of establishing a joint understanding of what's going on for you. And then it's about me teaching you different skills and techniques to kind of manage and overcome your own problems for yourself. So the techniques that we look at in CBT are cognitive, so they're techniques which challenge thoughts and the way that we think and the way that we process things. And then there's behavioural techniques as well, which look at kind of challenging our behavioural responses and the way that we kind of adapt and learn to overcome. So treating needle phobia in CBT, this is a problem that, is very, very responsive to CBT treatment. CBT is actually the recommended treatment of choice for phobia. And in my experience, this is something that, responds really, really quickly and really well to this type of treatment. So what is needle phobia? So the obvious is that needle phobia is a specific fear of needles. But basically, phobias are things which cause irrational, intense fear reactions to things which actually, in reality, cause little or no danger. So phobias occur when a stimulus, so in this case needles, is paired with the fear or fight or flight response in the brain. And in therapy terms, we call this process conditioning. So your brain becomes conditioned to associate a trigger, so a needle, with a fear response. So in terms of where phobias are born from, there's often a specific event which, may have triggered off the phobia in the first place. So often people can put the finger on it and say, oh yeah, it's when I had this injection when I was a kid, or, I've had hospital treatment kind of growing up, or things like that. But sometimes, there is no kind of specific fear, and it's just a bit kind of, random in terms of where it's kind of started and where it's come from. what we tend to see with phobia is that over time they become strengthened by further experiences that we have. So, you know, often when people know you've got a phobia, they'll kind of do things to kind of frighten you or scare you. As a way of being funny, but these experiences actually strengthen that phobia further. And also avoidance, so avoiding the phobic item actually over time strengthens the phobia and fear response. And what we know about phobia is that when you are scared of something and you're faced with that trigger, you'll get a very intense phobic reaction. So you'll feel it physically in your body. So you'll get symptoms such as shaking, sweating, your heart racing, you'll hyperventilate. And then you'll also get this kind of impending, you know, sense of fear, doom, and just this really intense need to kind of escape or get out of there or do something to kind of mediate the threat. So why is it important to work on needle phobia now? So I suppose my motivation in creating this little video is that obviously we're in the midst of a global pandemic. We've got a tiny glimmer of hope at the light at the end of the tunnel, in that, you know, the idea is if we can all kind of get vaccinated, we'll start to kind of edge towards normal life again. But what I've become really aware of is that people with needle phobia just don't feel like they've got that choice. So if you want to work on your needle phobia now, it's a way of giving you that choice back. Obviously, you know, you might not want to have the vaccination, but having the choice is very, very important. Obviously, longer term, there's ongoing health benefits as well. So you can have further vaccinations, blood tests, investigations, get yourself off on holiday when we can travel the world again and see, you know, parts of the world which require certain vaccinations for you to get there. But I suppose another reason why it's important to work on it now is that, you know, therapy it's expanding day by day. It's so readily available. It's something that we're all much more able to talk about. And so there's really just no need to suffer in silence anymore. And I suppose for me, one of the other main things really is that this treatment for this type of phobia works really quickly, and you know, the effects are very long lasting. So I've actually used the type of treatment I'm going to talk to you about shortly with my own spider phobia. My phobia was horrendous. I would have night terrors. I was so scared of spiders. It was unreal. And now I'm literally at a point where a spider came into my kitchen yesterday. I picked it up in my hand and put it outside. It just doesn't bother me anymore. So not only is it something that, you know, provides pretty quick relief, but it's also reasonably long lasting. So how does CBT treat needle phobia? So I suppose in basic form, it's about us helping your brain to learn that the thing it's scared about isn't actually dangerous and it doesn't need to be feared anymore. So the way that we treat it is we treat the phobia very gradually. We, over time, then desensitize your brain to needles. And what we tend to find is if we do it kind of gradually enough and at your own pace, over time, your phobic response will be dissolved and eventually you won't have the fear anymore. The key with treatment, though, is that it's about conducting it at your own pace. So I always say to my patients that at no point am I going to throw you in the deep end. At no point am I going to push you to do something that you don't feel comfortable with. It's about you feeling like you're in control and feeling like you're pacing it, you know, right for you. Some people want to whiz through treatment, and in theory and in reality, needle phobia is something that you can overcome within, like, you know, half a day, a matter of hours. But for a lot of people, it's something that does take time because it, you know, the phobic response is just so intense. So this here is basically something that we use in treatment to explain the workings of a phobia. So at the top, we've got what we call previous experience or fear conditioning. So this is kind of where the fears come from in the first place. So for a lot of people, there will be something we can put in there. For me, with my spider phobia, I think it was been shown a article in a newspaper from my grandma of a mum who'd got bitten by a spider and had her legs amputated. So it's quite a specific, you know, trigger for me. But for people with needle phobia, it may be a specific thing there, but for others, that box might be blank and we might not know. But these next four kind of headings are kind of applicable to all phobias. So the first box is looking at triggers. So in needle phobia, there may be just kind of one thing that triggers off the phobic response, or there may be lots and lots of different things. So often, like, the obvious is actually seeing a needle, having an injection, having a blood test. But actually the triggers can be quite broad and far-reaching. So it could be something like, you know, anything shiny, anything sharp. It could be just photos. It could be the word needle. It could be writing it down. So what we would always do in treatment is try to figure out what your triggers are first of all, because that will help us later on in treatment to decide where we start with the kind of the exposure and desensitization process. So what happens then when you're faced with a trigger is that very, very quickly you go into what we call the fight and flight response. So your brain thinks, oh my God, this is something that I'm really, really scared of. So as a result of being faced with the thing it feels is threatening, it kicks off the fight and flight response. So for those of you that don't know what the fight and flight response is, this is something that all human beings have. It's our body's natural way of protecting us from threats and danger. And it's something that, you know, we have evolved with throughout the years since caveman days. In phobia, this fight and flight response is actually, you know, it actually kind of gets brought online in response to the thing that we're scared of, whereas typically it might be kind of brought online if we're crossing the road and, you know, like a truck's coming at us at full speed or something like that. But basically the fight and flight response is there to help us to fight off a threat or to flee from it. What we tend to find in phobia is that it's the flight response, that kicks in where you just want to avoid and get away. So what then happens, so you get the anxiety and fight and flight response, which tends to manifest physically in your body as heart racing, you know, sweating, shaking, trouble breathing. And then we'll get this behavioural response of just avoiding and getting away. And what happens is when we kind of avoid the trigger and get away from it, is we get short-term relief. So the fight and flight response drops, we start to feel better. And what that does in our brain is it conditions this avoidance response. So our brain thinks, that was really, really good there. You know, I felt scared, I felt physically horrible, I got away from it, I felt better. So yeah, that's a strategy that works. So you get short-term relief and your brain thinks, actually, yeah, this is a good thing to do. But the problem is with avoidance is that literally only works short term, because the next time you are then shown a needle or faced with the thing that you're scared of, you go back into fight and flight response, and then you have to do something to kind of avoid and get over it again. So this is just another little picture that explains that further. So obviously we perceive something that's dangerous, we avoid it, we get this brief relief, but over time, the anxiety grows. The more that we avoid it, the anxiety gets worse, and the more that we kind of see it as dangerous. So just have a think now, like for you, how do you think you're trapped by your needle phobia? You know, how does it impact on your life, and you know, what's it holding you back from doing? So what I'm going to talk to you about now is the treatment. So this is the bit that you've probably been waiting for. So the treatment for needle phobia is something called graded exposure. It's really simplistic and it's really kind of easy to do. Not necessarily easy in terms of obviously we're going to be facing fear, but it's logical and straightforward. So basically, it's a simple way of decreasing fear around certain stimuli, and it promotes something, what we call in CBT called habituation or desensitization. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to do some really, really terrible artwork on paint, just to draw out what happens, well, basically what habituation is. So just bear with me 1 second and let's have a look at this. So you're really going to have to not judge me for my terrible drawing skills. If we were sat together in therapy, I'd be drawing this out by hand and hopefully it'd be a little bit better. So basically, in phobia, when we're faced with something that we feel scared of, so in needle phobia, when we're faced with a needle, what happens very quickly is we get a very sharp anxiety, fight and flight response. So adrenaline kicks in, our heart starts racing, we start feeling really scared, and anxiety just hits the roof. So obviously, because anxiety is feeling scared is an unpleasant experience for us, at this point, we often do something to get rid of that. So this is where we avoid, we run off, we leave the situation. And what then happens is very, very quickly is the anxiety drops. And so we think, oh yeah, that's great, I feel better. That only works until the next time we see a needle and we get the fear response again. So we avoid, and then the anxiety drops. And basically we get stuck in this kind of constant up and down cycle where we are faced with something we're scared of, we avoid it, gets better, and then we're scared again when we're faced with it again. So what we're going to try and do in therapy, and in terms of how exposure therapy works. So I'll draw the graph out again. So what we want to do is we want to approach needles in a different way. So what we're going to do is very, very gradually start to expose you to needles and to your phobia. And what we will do, what we will find is when you're faced with a trigger, yes, your anxiety will rise. But at this point where you'd normally kind of avoid or get out of the situation or kind of, just try to get away from it, what we want you to do is to actually expose yourself to it. So stick with the thing that you're scared of, because what we know as therapists is that what happens in your brain when you face your fear and you face something that, normally creates anxiety, is that our brains are very clever. And what happens very quickly is that, yes, you'll stay anxious for a little bit of time, but then very quickly what starts to happen is a process called habituation. So habituation is the posh term for your brain getting used to it. So if you're faced with something that you're scared of, you stick with it, you do nothing about it, very quickly your brain starts thinking, oh yeah, that isn't scary, I haven't died, nothing bad's happened, I'm okay. And so rather than creating more adrenaline and more of a fear response, it starts to drop the adrenaline levels in your body, and the anxiety very quickly then starts to drop. That's the first time that you kind of expose yourself to it. And what we then tend to find is that after you've done it once, the second time you expose yourself to that trigger is you will get anxious again, but the anxiety will drop off quicker. And then the third time you'll get anxious, but it'll drop off quicker again, until eventually you can face that fear and that kind of phobic trigger and basically get no anxiety or a very minimal fear response. So in exposure therapy, this is what we're trying to, this is the process that we're trying to bring online, and this is what we want the process that we want your brain to go through. But the important thing is, where have I gone? Here we go. So the important thing is when we're doing exposure, is that we need to stick to the 4 general principles of it. So principle 1 of exposure is that it needs to be graded. So there is literally no point in us throwing you in at the deep end and just making you kind of get an injection or get a blood test straight off the bat. All that really is going to do is it's going to terrify your brain and strengthen the fear even more. So what we want to do is we want to grade your exposure to needles, and this is where the doing it at your own pace comes in. So we want to start off with something that feels manageable and creates a little bit of anxiety, but doesn't feel like you're literally jumping off the edge of a cliff and taking a leap of faith. What we then want it to be is we want it to be repeated. So once you've done something once, so once you've exposed yourself to something that feels manageable once, we want you to repeat your exposure to that. And I always say to people, you want to repeat your exposure to it to a point where you start to feel bored. So you can't be bored and scared of something. So if you get to a point where you're sick to death of doing that exposure task because you're bored of it, that's a really, really positive sign. The other thing we need to kind of consider is exposure needs to be time limited. And so what I mean by that is there's literally no point in us just showing you a needle for 10 seconds and then getting rid of it. We need to stick with that trigger for long enough for that habituation process to happen. So habituation, the first time it happens, can take maybe up to 20 minutes. The first time you're facing something, it can take a while for that peak and that trough to happen. But what we know in therapy is that the more that you then expose yourself to it, that actual response, that peak and trough actually starts to happen quicker. It will get quicker and easier as you go along. But you need to stick with the trigger that you're working on for long enough for that peak and trough to happen. If you don't do that, all you're going to do is you're going to strengthen the fear, and you're going to basically show your brain that this is a trigger, this makes me feel scared, I need to avoid it even more. And then the final thing that we need to consider is to do exposure without distraction. So what that means is don't be doing a step of exposure, but with your phone there, or talking to your friend, or listening to music to take your mind off it. Taking your mind off it does not do you any favours. And all it's going to do is it's going to keep you kind of feeling more scared. So we want to do it without distraction, so your brain gets the full kind of exposure to what you're exposing yourself to, so that it can habituate more quickly. If you distract yourself, you're just going to prolong the fear, and it's going to take longer for it to get used to it. And then, so they're the 4 principles of exposure. And like I said on the bottom point, we really want to make goals more difficult as you go along. So we want to start off small and edge towards your end goal in a very kind of steady way. And so what we do in therapy to do this is we use something called a hierarchy. So this here is an example of an exposure hierarchy. So what you do is at the top, 100%, you'd have the absolute worst case scenario for you in relation to needle phobia. So it might be like having an injection or a blood test. And then at the absolute bottom is something that feels relatively easy or benign, or doesn't cause too much anxiety. And then what you do is you make this specific to you. So this is just an example I've drawn up. Yours will be different and it will be personal to you. But you basically think about what are all the different kind of graded steps, and what would create 50% anxiety for you, what would create 80% anxiety. And you basically then use this hierarchy to very steadily, like think of it as a step ladder. So you work through the different steps one by one. So you start at the bottom, you start at 10%. You use those 4 principles of exposure again. So you kind of repeat it. So you say if we're starting at 10% here, we'd write out the word needle and write it out and write it out and write it out until it creates no anxiety. Once you've cracked that, you then move on to 20% and you look at cartoon drawings of the needle. And then you repeat and repeat and repeat till you're bored of that, and then you move on to the next one. And basically what you're going to do is, if you do it like that and do it gradually enough, is you'll eventually surprise yourself and you'll work up this hierarchy, and you'll get to kind of the top level of the hierarchy without feeling like you've been thrown in at the deep end, because you gradually grade yourself towards it. So like I said, remember, stick to the 4 general principles: grade, repeat, time it, and do it without distraction. And then you can use this exposure form here to monitor your progress. So you would pick which ladder of the hierarchy you're on, write down when you're starting it, how anxious you feel before you do the exposure task, how anxious you're feeling in the middle, and then what your anxiety is like after you've stopped, and then write down the time finished. And what you should find is that the more you grade and repeat it, is that these anxiety ratings will drop. You want to get a drop of around at least 50% before you even consider moving on to the next step. But I would say try and get it to as close to 0 as possible. And then once you've kind of got your anxiety ratings for the step you're working on as close to 0 as possible, then you move on to the next one, and you literally just repeat the same thing. And what you will find then is basically over time, you will get to a point where you can tackle all of the steps on the exposure hierarchy, and eventually overcome your own phobia and overcome your own fear. So if you've got any questions about anything that I've said to you today, I know it's a very brief overview, brief whistle-stop tour, but if you've got any questions that you want to ask me about what I've discussed today, please feel free to contact me. You can email me, you can Facebook me, you can Instagram me. I'll happily, answer any of the questions that you've got. I've also got some worksheets that you can use. So if you want to tackle this yourself and use some of the ideas I've talked about today, I've got some worksheets that I can email you over for free, and you can use them alongside your own exposure. And obviously, like I said to you at the start of the presentation, you can kind of, if you feel that you need some kind of support in doing this, you can contact me. I provide private therapy sessions, but you can also get CBT for free through your local NHS IAP service. And yeah, basically let me or one of my fellow therapists help you and get you to a point where you can overcome this fear and phobia. But thank you all so much for listening to me today. I hope it's not been too kind of boring or intense. And yeah, look after yourselves and take care. Bye-bye.